How are you doing, Generation X? I wanted to reach out to you today. I wanted to talk about our history, or even our parents' history, or even our great grandparents' history. Because the children that we've been creating and the children that have been populating the world do not have the accounts that we had, or our grandparents, or our great grandparents. I know this last couple of years with the COVID has taken out a lot of older people, also my generation. 10 years ago, cancer was really taking out most of the generation, all these diseases and disorders. But we got to focus on that, because there must have been this Mandela effect. I know we've heard about it, but my generation has known so many things and have seen so many things come into fruition. My generation, not everyone had TV. That didn't come out till like the 1950s, 1960s, and it became a little cheaper where everyone could wind up having that in the house. My mother's generation, not everyone also had TV. If you didn't have money for it, you just couldn't have it. So the way the world changed when television came in, or as I like to call it, the tell-lie vision. They'll tell you a lie and you'll envision it. Um, when I was young, you weren't allowed to be sitting there in front of the TV. You get reprimanded and yelled at if you were watching TV or if you were flicking through the channels. You were supposed to be outside, unheard, unseen. So that was my generation. 20, 30 years later, when we started making children, we're having the TV babysit the child, and we have no idea what's happening on that television because we assume that the 1960s, 70s, and 80s is the same type of mentality that is brought to you in that television. But it isn't. It had changed quickly. But my generation could come and atone for so many things. Plastic coming into the world, disorders and diseases coming into the world. We only had 3 to 7 vaccines. We were Generation X. We wound up getting vaccines on the arm, and X marks the spot. All of us had this brand or tattoo or burn, something from that vaccine wind up staying on that arm lifelong. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what this is all about. Because way back before my parents were coming into the world, my grandparents, they only had maybe 1 or 2 vaccines. Measles, bumps, maybe rubella. I don't know. It wasn't that many. But back then they had a different history. Back then they had a different culture. Back then it was a different mentality. Back then it was a different population. Back then there was still a struggle for world domination. Because when my mother was born, she was born in 1943, Hitler was 2 or 3 years busy with fighting a war and dominating the world. And he wound up getting this bad reputation. You know, anyone in war gets a bad reputation, let's put it that way. But we know that there's always someone hidden behind the scenes. And that's the thing also that my generation noticed. Because my mother's generation, they grew up with President Kennedy, in the United States. Even though my mom wasn't. Oh no, she was just living here in the United States when he was assassinated. So they came up with that word conspiracy theories. My generation, we weren't allowed to talk about theories, ideas, but we were all thinkers. All of us could see through shit because there's something that you have inside of you, and you perfected at 2 years old. It's called discernment. Yeah, you see it right away, and you've used it against your parents right away at 2, 3 years old. You called them out on what they were doing, what they were thinking, their way of life. I've done it. I've seen that in my early life that the lies that were given to me, something inside knew that's not right. But you couldn't call out your parents. You couldn't argue with them. Back then when I was a kid, we didn't have child protective service, and you called out your parents. this came right to your face, or one of these came up to your face, or you got punished, or you were shoved outside, or something. So we have to understand that all generations had suffered a great reset. My great grandparents, they were the last um, group of children that were being slaved out. Around the world, there was a whole bunch of kids being slaved out. Uh, they call them foundling homes in Europe. Also, they called them out here foundling homes. You had orphanages. If you weren't married, if you had a child out of wedlock, it would either have gone to the orphanage or the church, um, sometimes to the hospitals, and they would find a place for these children. Of course, they're not finding them homes. Of course, they're not finding them parents. They just find a place for these children. And the deeper you go and the deeper you research, you start to open up these rabbit holes that they talk about, and you pull the string together, and then you see that 50 of them, 10, maybe 1,000 of them all pull in together, and you could read in between the lines. That's my generation. My generation knew all about it. That's why they came up with this conspiracy theories to try to shut you up, make sure you can't say anything. That's why I guess this COVID came out, because the first thing they did with the COVID, locked up all of the people older than me, which were my parents and great grandparents, or the people's parents and great grandparents. I never really met my great grandparents or my grandparents. So we know that their history is different. The great great grandparents, they were all slaved out, all going around the world. There's accounts in Europe that talk about these foundling homes, and I didn't know about these foundling homes until I moved out to Europe. I was lucky enough to be born and raised here in the States. Wind up going to the military a few years, and then after that, I wound up moving to Europe, and I lived there 16 years. And I was lucky enough to just walk in my authentic state, my organic, authentic me. And not too many people have that chance to do. Most of them that watch the television try to become what they saw on the television. And as a child, my father wouldn't allow the television in the house, so you just had to be the organic, authentic you. And anyone that you met outside was either a role model or a model as to, do I want to be a little like that? Do I want to be a little like this? Do I want to think like they do? Do I want to act like they do? Well, you just had special children back then. They called us indigo children, most of us. And before that, there were star seeds and all these other beautiful names of children. Um, Now, all of us possess a beautiful talent, and that's that discernment. And we know who we are right away in our youth, but we wind up getting distracted with school and the system. And the system is economics, entertainment, education, labor law, religion, politics, war, sex, counter war, all of that. And understand that you are under attack 365 days a year, 7 days a week. And if you don't understand that, then anything else will confuse you. Now, once you understand that, especially our Generation X, now we're the last generation to really um, have the history, understand the past history, understand how these resets kept coming out and when they were happening. And if you do the research, you'll see that there are always resets. Every 5 to 10 years on different countries, there's different resets. And then there's one major reset. And that's what they were trying to do with this COVID, try to get that major reset, but they still couldn't kill us all. They have never, ever been able to kill off the human beings. And when I say they, I'm talking about the powers that be, or the ones that think they're powers that be, which I know they're not, because they've never had power over me. I've always been able to walk in my authentic self, and a lot of people can't stomach a lot of things that I will go ahead and say to them. I won't be derogatory, I won't be mean, but common sense is common sense, and all of us can walk in our own path with common sense. You really don't have to be smart. I have a brother, he's summa cum laude, and he's one of those guys, engineer. I have a sister, she's an educator. I have another brother, he's more like I guess you could say politician. And me, I was a wanderer, you know. I just went out and I don't know if you want to call it the power of God or the power of presence or the power of source, but I never really had to struggle. There were times where we all need a little bit of help, but I never really had to struggle and have to run back home. That I didn't have to do. I was able to live abroad and be lucky. You know, for instance, tell my story in a nutshell. I didn't come from the best childhoods. I don't think I even had a childhood because inside of the womb, I was already protecting my family. When I was born, I wind up knowing something inside a sixth sense that I would have to be that guardian for the family, for my mother's brothers and sisters. And the only one that really could witness it, I think, was my sister, because from what I hear, she wrote a lot of diaries of things that happened to us. But that's not the important story. The important story is that all of us go through things and then we wind up understanding certain things where we can realize and come into another understanding of what is truly happening. Now, I was never blessed like my brother to sit there, go to school, and get that education to become an engineer. I became a massage therapist and I was a baseball player. And being a baseball player, I got lucky. I played in 68 countries. That was my thing. And I would travel to 68 countries. But when you bounce over to 68 countries, it's always difficult to reset yourself, set yourself back up, because I wasn't getting the millions that baseball players would get in the States. You get a couple of thousand, maybe a car, maybe a house. So, as all those years, as I was traveling, I started to see things happen and world events transpire. And I would keep in contact with the family in the States, and they would tell me the things that were transpiring in the States, and I would let them know what's transpiring in the countries I was in. Uh, Throughout my life, my mother has always been a spiritual person, you know, understanding the Bible and always praying to God, lighting a candle for the family. She always had something like that. And her children, we were never taught that, but we witnessed it, we saw it. So some of us would do the same things. Like, for instance, I would always have a picture of my grandparents because they were someone that my mother always had, and they always lit a candle for the people in the past. I didn't know that um, there was a reason behind it, because there are different cultures that do different things. We were never into the spirituality of ancestors or anything like that. We just commemorated the people that we loved, and my mother loved her father, and would always commemorate having the picture in the house. Now, those certain things that we just took over, not knowing why we were doing it. So, just like the world and history, we don't know why we do anything. Most of the time, we are sitting there trying to figure out who we are, walking in our authentic self. And I've never gotten to see people have the chance to walk in their organic, authentic self. Because everyone that I knew in the States stayed in the States. Everyone that I knew in Europe pretty much stayed in Europe. No one really got out and explored like I did. I really got out there and got in there 68 countries, and I was able to get to know myself even more and then get to know the world even more. And maybe I had more role models because I wasn't watching TV and trying to pick off the role models I had on TV. I was meeting people in new countries and new places, locals, aboriginals, people of high stature, low stature, you name it. And I was able to shake hands, break bread with more than 1 million people in the world. And I mean literally shake hands, hug, talk with them. Over 1 million people. Could be more. But most of us don't get out as much as I did to understand what's out there. As a kid, I was lucky. I had people coming from Dominican Republic, Haiti, Singapore, Curacao, Germany, Holland, Turks Island, and all these people would tell me their histories. So right away, school, education, that part of the system was shut down right away. There was no need to believe too much into that because history, I was getting it from the horse's mouth, the people from the country. And everything they had just rebutted anything that they gave us in school. And when you sit there and you raise your hand and you're sitting there, and I don't know if I was sounding intelligent or not, but I would let them know that there are certain things happening in the world that we don't know about. And I don't know if I was ahead of my time or behind my time. But I know that not being privileged to having TV and not watching TV, my generation had more encyclopedias and books. Now, there are a lot of us that did read, but I think half a Generation X didn't even care to read. They were just out there doing their own thing. Most of us just had to go out, be outside, be in that nature because we didn't have that many toys. We definitely didn't have any computers. We didn't have mobile cell phones or anything like that. We had to go to the library for fun. We had to go play with sticks and rocks for fun. When I saw my nephews and nieces come into the world, I kind of got jealous over the toys that they had and thought, man, I wish I wanted one. And even as an adult, I wanted one because we didn't have those things. We didn't have any of that. We never understood how fast the Industrial Revolution came about. Or maybe we didn't take a time for it because I know my generation had seen it. We watched that Industrial Revolution come in. We watched these plastics come in. We watched these Tupperwares come in. We watched these diseases come in. Some of us were not old enough to hear President Nixon quote his war on cancer. But my generation watched that war on cancer because we didn't have that many diseases. The major one that was on TV worldwide was muscular dystrophy and Jerry Lewis. Go ahead, Generation X, you know what I'm talking about. And that was the biggest disease at that time. We did have measles, mumps, rubella, but there was very few. There's no one that we knew in our generation. If you grew up in Long Island where I did, we didn't see that much. We did have stories about something that happened in Heartland America, but we didn't really talk about it because if you're from New York, California, from New York to California, that big smile underneath, that's all the mixed people, immigrants. Above that is Heartland America, and that's where all these Europeans were coming and sanctioning themselves. Um, we didn't know that they were being experimented on by their own, you know. And now, 50 years later, I see that the population dropped amongst the Heartland America and the white people, and I started to think, wow, now I understand a little bit of why what was happening with those experiments. Is they had another experiment down here, but for instance, up there it was full force only on the white people. Whatever's happened down underneath the states, that was happening to a whole bunch of mixed people that were coming over. Of course, these are all people that were not originally born in the states. Not all of them, some of them. There were many coming over from different countries. My parents came over from different countries. We were mixed with so many different things that if you put all the foods on the table together, you'll have an ulcer. But if you mix the cultures together, yeah, you get someone like me, German, Dutch, Jewish, Dominican, Caribbean. You're like, what the? So there's a whole bunch of mixes in there. Now, that's when I understood the great rape of the whole world. There was a major rape. I started to see that when I was doing history, trying to research it. I came across Color Confrontation and the ISIS papers from Francis Cress Welsing, and then I started to see why why the fear came in with the Great Rape, because someone of my culture or anyone that has melanated skin, if they mix with the yellow, black, red, brown, it becomes brown. You mix it with the white, it becomes brown. So back in the days with the French and the European wars and the World War I and World War II and the Roman soldiers, all of that, I understand that's something that needs to be explored. And at one point, you start to think, okay, if people are marching like the Romans, if they're marching like 5, 6 months, they're not marching with women, number one. And when they finally get to a place where they're going to have war, then they're talking about rape and pillaging. So if you're doing that every 6 months, what is it you're doing during the 6 months, when you don't have those people to rape and pillage? That's when the bells and whistles started to go off with these mages and pages and all these kids. Hey, if you could pick up this weapon, come on, you could fight for us. Of course, it was like a sword. Pen is the sword, but uh, all these kids were indoctrinated into war. So that's back then. Then I started to think, okay, Roman. If you break the word down, Ro means egg, man is man. So egg and man or Eggman. Then I started to think, ooh, that's where maybe that idea that happened 30, 40 years later, when they started finding out all these Roman Catholic priests were raping little boys and stuff like that, that's when the bells and whistles went off, and I started to tie that in there. And I used to tie it in with comedy, not just tie it in as history, because I didn't, a lot of people just want to fight you on anything that you learn, especially, if you're learning it from other sources. Because if everyone's not getting the same thing, National Geographic Channel, Discovery Channel, libraries, encyclopedias, if that's all a large group has, then I'm sitting there outside of the cusp because I'm learning from all these countries that I'm going to. I'm not saying that my education was better, it was just more broader. You know? I didn't have to sit there and be indoctrinated fully in believing in the history that they were giving and presenting to us, and the lifestyle they were giving and presenting to us, in the way of life with the television, trying to form and create us. Um, Going to the 68 countries, I've seen so many different people that if I were to watch TV now, I still don't see the characters that I've seen around the world. So there are an idea of what they'd like to bring out on that television, and they don't encompass everything, especially history. They don't encompass any of that. My generation, Generation X, we watched history be erased right in front of our eyes and be introduced with current events. We saw that, I think it was 1983 or 1984 that started to come in. They took away our history. It was current events. I wind up joining the military in '89, so I left the States, and anything else that I was learning, I just left that behind. Went into the military, traveled the world, and then went over to Europe, traveled the world. So in those 16, let's say about 20 years, I wasn't being indoctrinated with the things in the States, and then over in Europe, it was a different mentality, different lifestyle, different thought process, different character. I remember in the 1970s, you could still have an idea and bring it to fruition. And in the 80s, that's when everything became fantastic. I left at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, went over to Europe, and it was just like 1970 again. I was like, oh my goodness, it's so calm, it's so serene, it's so relaxed. Not everyone has gotten into the idea and the rut of working 40 hours a week and businesses, entrepreneurship. That was still on the rise, but it wasn't everywhere, you know.